Hello, it's 5 o'clock. It's Wednesday. Here we are again. I'm hoping this is going to work today because, as any of you who were watching yesterday or who have watched yesterday's video will know, my internet cut out so many times that I ended up redoing it in the evening, much later on. And it seemed to work. I didn't have any notifications that it was cutting out, but um, actually it did. When I watched some of it back, there was sort of odd blips here and there. If it carries on like that, I guess I might stop doing it live and might just upload them to this page because it probably doesn't matter terribly to some of you anyway. I do it live because it's much simpler for me. Anyway, here we are. I've snuck back into my study because my husband's away, although there's this big machine behind me. You can see behind my chair. And sundry things. Yeah, I always keep a pair of pliers on my desk. And screwdriver, yeah. It doesn't really feel like my office, but anyway, I have reasonably willingly given it up because it's more practical for him to use it than me. Well, I'm homeschooling the kids. So yes, and I don't want him homeschooling the children because his idea of explaining maths to an 11-year-old is to introduce kind of a version of the same concept that you will do later on at A level. So I actually threatened my son with that the other day. I said, if you don't knuckle under and do your maths with me, I'm sending you into Daddy. And my son said, no, don't send me to Daddy, please don't send me to Daddy. Because, Daddy's idea of explaining things is to completely confuse the child. Anyway, there we are. We all have our strengths. He has many strengths, but explaining things to the kids is not necessarily one of them. Certainly not when it comes to maths. So we're on chapter 8. Joe is back in Lucy's world and was worried because he saw the flicker of firelight down the side streets of where he's arrived. He turned up back on Thames Street because he always arrives back where he started, where he was when he left. So he turned up back on Thames Street near the river and he could see the flickering light of fire down the side street and was very anxious about that. But then he realised it's a huge party and there are bonfires all along both sides of the river and people standing around talking and dancing and drinking and things. So he doesn't know what date it is still. He doesn't know how long it is after he was last here. He presumes it is after he was last here, not before it. And the city's all still standing, so it's presumably before the fire, unless the fire doesn't happen. He just doesn't really know. Chapter 8. Just then, a man came out of a tavern with a fiddle and struck up a tune. Joe listened. How peculiar. Here he was over 300 years back in the past, and yet it was exactly the kind of music he'd heard at barn dances and country fairs in his own world. Almost immediately, people began to dance in a happy but disorganised way. One of the men was wearing a ridiculous hat with feathers sprouting out of it. Another, in a dress with a wide skirt, turned out also to be a man. In the glow of the fire, Joe saw that his face had been powdered white, and there were red circles on his cheeks, and a tiny black diamond on his temple, just like a pantomime dame. His wig wobbled this way and that as he clumped around the quayside. The onlookers whooped and clapped, and the man fluttered his eyelashes and blew kisses to them. After watching for a few minutes, Joe made his way back to Thames Street. With luck, he might find some of the landmarks he'd passed with Lucy. If not, at least she told him the name of the road where she lived, so he could ask for directions. Thames Street itself was fairly quiet after the merriment on the quay, but in the narrow streets that led off it, light spilled from open doorways as private parties spread onto the road. People leaned out of their windows, singing and joking, raising their glasses in toasts. Joe made his way up one of these, skirting one bonfire and then another, weaving his way in and out of the revellers. Really, with all these flames so close to the buildings, it was a wonder that the great fire wouldn't start tonight. Perhaps it would, he thought abruptly. Perhaps the history books were wrong, and it hadn't been a baker's shop. Or maybe it had been, but it had been the same night as this celebration, whatever it was. If fire broke out in several different places at once, that would account for the whole of London burning down. Hold on a minute. There's rather loud oboe practice going on. Hang on a minute. Sorry about that. There's a hive of activity here on account of the fact that I promised my kids that if they got all of their practice done before I cooked tea, then we could have tea and watch the sewing bee, because we absolutely love that. My children may all be boys, but it doesn't matter. We still love watching it together. So, anyway, yes, if fire broke out in several places at once, that would account for the whole of London burning down. Excuse me, he touched the sleeve of a woman who stood watching some children careering around, clearly enjoying themselves every bit as much as the adults. The woman turned. Can you tell me, what's the date today? Joe asked. It's the 14th of August, of course. Joe frowned, so it definitely wasn't the night of the fire. He wasn't sure whether to be glad or disappointed. He felt both somehow. Was it wrong, he wondered, to want to be here when the fire happened? Wasn't it the same as wanting to see Cromwell's head on a pole? Voyeuristic, Dad called it, wanting to see someone else's misfortune. Joe's shoulders hunched up on their own, as though his parents were there to tell him off. He shook himself. This was daft. Nobody else needed to know what was going through his mind. He watched a small girl hopping about in the firelight and thought about the woman's exact words. The 14th of August, of course, as though Joe should know. People didn't usually say, of course, if you asked them the date, so it must be significant. But it meant nothing to him. What is everyone celebrating? He asked. The woman looked astonished. Beating the Dutch, of course. What, today? No, she hooted with laughter. On St. James's Day last month. But the King declared a public holiday for today. As she spoke, there was a distant volley of bangs. That's another round of fireworks up at Whitehall, she said. Oh. Joe was none the wiser. It is still 1666, he asked, just to be sure. Of course. The woman was staring at him now as though he were mad. Never mind, he thought, heading on up the street. He would never see her again, so it didn't matter what she thought of his questions. The chief thing was that the fire wasn't going to start tonight, so there was still a chance that he and Lucy could stop it. Although he counted the days on his fingers, it would be 18 days till the 1st of September, 19 until the fire. He felt deflated. The longest he'd ever stayed in Lucy's world was 6 days, which had been one of the times he was at Fishbourne. Other than that, it was usually only a night or two, or even shorter, as it had been earlier today. Well, today in his own world, which was about 6 weeks ago in Lucy's time. He came to another crossroads with a slightly wider road. In both directions there were more bonfires, more music and dancing, drinking and laughter. He didn't see any buildings he knew. He wasn't even sure he'd been along this street before. Plucking up courage, he approached a man who leant in a doorway with a tankard of beer. "Excuse me, sir, which way do I go for Threadneedle Street?" The man pointed. "Take a left just along there, where Dowgate Hill meets Walbrook, and carry on up till you come to the Stocks Market. The street you want is off to your right as you cross Poultry." Joe nodded and thanked him. He wasn't sure he quite understood, but if he could get as far as the Stocks Market, he should be able to find his way from there. "Was the young gentleman looking for Threadneedle Street?" asked a man's voice behind Joe. "We're going there ourselves." Joe turned around. "We'll gladly take you with us," the man said. Joe caught his breath. The man hadn't recognised him yet, but Lucy knew quite well who he was. Sorry, I misread that. The man hadn't recognised him yet, but Joe knew quite well who he was. It was William Lucas again. In a way it was a stroke of luck, but he had no idea what to say. Time stretched out as he gazed wordlessly up at Lucy's father. How was he going to explain why he hadn't returned with Lucy? The family had made him so welcome. At the very least they would want to know where he'd been since then. He swallowed. "Joe!" Lucy ran forward from William's side. "It is you, isn't it?" She caught hold of his hand. "How extraordinary! I was thinking of you only a few minutes ago." "Well, I never!" exclaimed Ellen. "Master Hopkins, returned from the war." William Lucas beamed and shook Joe's hand firmly. "And he's even managed to keep the clothes we lent him in pristine condition." Ellen shook her head in wonder. "I should never have let you and Lucy go out that afternoon," she said. "Are you well? You weren't wounded or mistreated?" "It was my mistake," Lucy said quickly. "I was so sure we'd be all right with you dressed like that. But when those men grabbed you—" She shot Joe a look. Joe was bewildered. "I did try to find you," William said. "I went to Bridewell and to Tower Wharf, but they denied all knowledge of you. They swore they'd never even taken a boy of your age." "What was it like on the ship?" It was Peter who spoke now, his eyes round. "What kind of ship was it? Did you go into battle? Did you fight on St. James's Day? Were there cannons? And hand-to-hand combat? Must have been really exciting." "Enough, Peter," William raised his hand. "Give the poor boy a chance to speak." "I'm fine, thank you," Joe said politely. Lucy must have told them that he'd been taken by the pressmen. At least they seemed to think that was a satisfactory explanation. As for all Peter's questions, it was very tempting to invent some brave deeds to impress him. But Joe didn't dare, certainly not in front of William and Ellen. The only book he'd read about seafaring in the past was Treasure Island, and that was about pirates, not war. He was bound to get lots of things wrong if he made it up. "It wasn't as exciting as you'd think," he said, hoping he sounded modest. "My ship didn't see much of the action. In fact, I spent most of my time scrubbing the lower decks." They nodded. "Anyway, I'm glad to be back and in time to see some of the celebrations." "We've been across the river for a picnic in Lambeth Fields," Lucy said, seizing the chance to turn the conversation in a different direction. "And then we went to the pleasure gardens at Foxhall." "Yes, but Father wouldn't let us go to the bear garden." Peter cast a look of mock resentment at William. "The cockpit was quite violent enough, I thought," Ellen said with a grimace. "Honestly, Peter, you're a savage, wanting to watch these poor animals forced to fight. That little cockerel didn't stand a chance against the bigger one." "I agree," said Lucy primly. "It was horrible." "Well, you seemed pretty fascinated," teased Peter. "You didn't take your eyes off the birds." "Come now," said William. "Foxhall was supposed to be a pleasant family outing, not a source of dissent." He put his hands on Lucy and Peter's shoulders. "I think we should get ourselves safely home before we get caught up in the late-night revelry. It tends to get out of hand," he said to Joe, "especially the apprentices. I expect it's the same in Norwich. They get so few days off a year. It's not surprising they go a bit wild when they get an extra day's holiday. I should know. I was one once." He grinned ruefully. "I hope you'll come home with us." "I'd love to," Joe said. "Thank you, sir." William steered them forward, around the crowds and up Walbrook. It was properly dark now, and the light of the fires flared. For a second Joe thought of the flames soon to come. In less than a month all this would be gone, unless he and Lucy could find a way to save the city. He shivered. They passed the dark hulk of the stocks market and emerged onto Poultry, where the party was even more riotous. Beyond another bonfire, Joe spotted the General Letter Office. A minute or two later, they passed the Royal Exchange, where he and Lucy had seen the lady with her African slave boy. It was hard to believe that for Lucy that afternoon was weeks ago, when it was so fresh in his mind. "Here we are then," Ellen said, as they arrived outside the house. "Home to bed, though I'm not sure any of us is going to get much sleep tonight, with all this noise outside." She opened the front door. At once there was a high-pitched screech. "You remember Solomon?" Peter went down the dark hallway to the room opposite the kitchen and reappeared with the monkey on his shoulder. Joe reached up to take his hat off, but before he could, the monkey made a leap and grabbed it by the ruffles, shaking it gleefully, and then clamping the brim in its teeth while it scampered off to the sitting room. "You need to train that animal," Ellen said in exasperation. She went along to the kitchen and returned with a burning candle, with which she lit 3 more candles, which stood ready on the hall table. "I'll see about finding you a nightshirt and cap," she said to Joe. "You don't mind showing with Peter, do you?" "Of course not," Joe said. "It's very kind of you to have me." There was a creaking of floorboards upstairs and the sound of a door shutting. "That'll be stay-at-home Tobias," William said. "I invited him to come to Foxhall with us, but he declined. I don't think he went out with the other apprentices either. Such an odd boy. Still, at least we'll get a decent day's work out of him tomorrow while the rest are nursing their sore heads." Ellen and Lucy started up the stairs. Their flickering candles made their shadows jump around on the walls. Behind them, without a candle of his own, Joe had to feel his way. The stairs were uneven, and twice he nearly tripped. That would be another way a house might catch fire, he thought, if you fell down the stairs carrying a candle, or stumbled and set fire to a wall hanging. People at home loved to talk about a disaster waiting to happen, for this place really was one. Ellen led the way into Peter's room and lit a candle on the top of the chest of drawers. The bed was another 4-poster, with heavy curtains and a domed roof. Like Lucy's, you would hardly guess that this room belonged to a boy rather than an adult. The only toys here were a box of wooden bricks and a small carved horse and rider. There was a pair of stockings hanging over the edge of the chest of drawers, but no other clothes to be seen. Joe guessed that clothes were too expensive for people to have many, so they looked after them better. He was sure that was how it had been in every world so far, though nobody had actually told him so. Clearly, not yet either. And as for plastic, that wasn't going to be invented for centuries. Joe thought of his own room strewn with clothes, books, Lego, and all sorts of other toys. People had so much stuff in the modern world. Well, people like him, anyway. He waited for Ellen to pull out a spare mattress from beneath Peter's bed, but she went to the drawers and took out a long linen shirt and a brimless cap, like the one William had worn last time Joe was here. The cap was plainer. Excuse me. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Yeah. This cap was plainer, with embroidery and a strip around the edge. Joe he would look rather girly in it. "Peter will show you where we keep the tooth powder and cloths if you want to clean your teeth. But I imagine you don't mind waiting in the morning?" Ellen smiled. Joe shook his head. "You know where the clothes stool is, don't you? We don't have chamber pots in the bedrooms. And Mary will bring up a bowl of water in the morning for you both to wash." Joe nodded. "All right then, we'll bid you good night." She picked up her candle and left the room. Lucy hesitated, waiting for her mother to be out of earshot. But before she or Joe could say anything, Peter came in. She shrugged. "Good night," she said. "You know where we are if you need anything. Peter's a heavy sleeper. I hope he doesn't keep you awake with his snoring." She jabbed her brother in the ribs and went out, taking her candle with her. Joe grinned. "You can't be worse than my brother," he said to Peter. "You have a brother? I thought your family was dead." Joe coloured. "They are. He is." He cursed his thoughtlessness. He'd spoken much too cheerfully for someone who'd lost everything in the last couple of months. He sat down on the edge of the bed with his back to Peter and began to undress. For ages he lay rigidly beside Lucy's brother, waiting for him to go to sleep. He hated sharing a bed with someone else. But once Ellen had gone, he'd realised that this was what she'd meant by sharing with Peter. The room was terribly hot. From beyond the curtains, shouts and laughter carried on the night air through the open window. Still, the bed was big, and the mattress was softer and more comfortable than any of the mattresses he'd slept on in Lucy's other worlds, even if it did smell of sheep's wool. At last, Peter began to snore. Very quietly, Joe pushed back the sheet and got out of bed. He hoped Lucy wasn't asleep already. He needed to tell her where and when the real fire was going to break out, so that even if he wasn't there to help her, she could still try and do something to stop it. At the door, he paused to listen, then cautiously turned the handle. At that moment, the door of the room opposite opened. Joe shrank back. There was a rustle as someone crept along the hallway and down the stairs. Silently, Joe opened the door of Peter's room and tiptoed onto the landing. He peered down into the darkness. It was Tobias. He was going out. On instinct, Joe ran to grab his clothes. As he scrambled into them, he hoped Peter really was a heavy sleeper. It wouldn't be good if he woke up and found Joe gone. But whatever Tobias was doing at this time of night, wherever he was going, Joe felt certain he was up to no good. Talking to Lucy about the fire would have to wait. For now, he had to follow Tobias. So that's the end of chapter 8. Where is Tobias going? What's he up to? Why would you stay in through the whole party and then only go out late at night? Doesn't make any sense, does it? And Joe knows what he's like. Joe knows he probably isn't up to any good. So he's going to follow him. And if you come back tomorrow, you'll find out where they go. That's it for this evening. I hope you have a good evening. See you tomorrow.